Hello and welcome to a new episode of Nile TV Newsroom Live. I'm Raham Morsi, and if you're watching the show for the very first time, let me reintroduce you to what the show is all about. The show is composed of a number of different segments. First, we're going to take a closer look at the world of politics. Next comes business and finance. And sometimes we also learn more about what's happening in the world of technology, in addition to some episodes with cultural news and arts events. And then finally, we end with the sports segment. But first, we're going to take a short break and take a look at the world of politics. Welcome back. Starting off with President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, on Monday, heading a meeting of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. Presidential spokesman Councillor Ahmed Fahmy said that the meeting tackled several issues. Topping them is the current situation in Sudan. During his speech before the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, President al-Sisi said that Egypt follows up on the developments in Sudan, stressing that the country is keen not to intervene in other countries' internal affairs. The Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces called on all parties in Sudan to go for calm, adding that fighting would not serve the interests of the Sudanese people. The President also asserted that he is making intensive contacts with the Sudanese parties to ensure the safety of Egyptian forces in Sudan and secure their return. On the ground, fighting between the army and paramilitaries in Sudan has killed around 200 people and wounded 1,800, damaging hospitals and hampering aid after 3 days of urban warfare. A weeks-long power struggle exploded into deadly violence Saturday between the forces of Sudan's army chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and his deputy Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, who commands the paramilitary rapid support forces. The Sudan Doctor Syndicate said that Tuesday that at least 200 civilians were killed and more than 1,800 wounded. Fighting resumed early Tuesday around each side's main bases and at strategic government buildings, all of which are in residential areas. A U.S. diplomatic convoy came under fire on Monday in Sudan in an apparent attack by the fighters associated with Sudan's paramilitary rapid support forces in an incident the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken described as reckless and irresponsible. The story.
Washington's top diplomat said Tuesday that a U.S. embassy convoy came under fire in Sudan and denounced indiscriminate military operations as the country's armed forces and a powerful rival unleashed heavy weapons in urban areas for a fourth day. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken told reporters that the convoy of clearly marked embassy vehicles was attacked on Monday, and preliminary reports link the assailants to the Rapid Support Forces, the paramilitary group battling Sudan's military. Blinken said everyone in the convoy was safe. The convoy attack, along with earlier assaults on aid workers and the EU envoy's residence in the capital of the Khartoum, signaled further descent into chaos since the battle by two rival generals for control of Africa's third largest country erupted over the weekend. The State Department said late Monday that Blinken spoke by phone separately with the two generals. Blinken told reporters at the Group of Seven Wealthy Nations meeting in Japan on Tuesday that any attacks or threats or dangers posed to the U.S. diplomats were totally unacceptable. He appealed for an immediate 24-hour ceasefire as the foundation for a longer truce and a return to negotiations. The Gallo said in a series of tweets Tuesday that he had approved a 24-hour humanitarian truce after speaking to Blinken, while the Sudanese military said more troops would join the battle and it would widen the scope of its operations against the RSF. Following the goal, Daglo said in a tweet that the pair had discussed pressing issues in Sudan, adding that he was grateful for Blinken and the U.S. commitment to restoring stability in Sudan.
Foreign Minister Sameh Shukri held a phone call on Monday with the Saudi counterpart Emir Faisal bin Farhan over the recent developments in Sudan. Foreign Ministry spokesman Ahmed Abu Zaid said that the phone call tackled an exchange of views over the Sudanese crisis, where both sides agreed on the importance of intensifying efforts to restore Sudan's stability and safety. Shukri asserted the importance of using wisdom to reach a ceasefire very soon, avoid bloodshed and preserve Sudan's unity. The two top diplomats also agreed on continuing consultations over the crisis development and means of curbing it during the coming period. Meanwhile, Foreign Ministry spokesman Ahmed Abu Zaid said that the Foreign Minister Sameh Shukri received a phone call Monday from his French counterpart Catherine Colonna to weigh the latest situation in Sudan. Abu Zaid added that the French minister expressed concern over the military confrontations in Sudan, which led to the death of dozens of civilians. The talks focused on means of reaching a settlement for the Sudanese conflict through negotiations between all disputed parties to lead the country back to its political path. The two sides agreed on stopping any external interventions and boosting efforts to regain security and stability in Sudan. The talks also tackled the outcome of the Arab League emergency meeting, which was held in Cairo over the Sudanese issue. The Arab League Council called for an immediate end to all clashes in Sudan and a swift return to the peaceful track of solving the crisis. In the wake of an emergency meeting on the level of Arab permanent representatives, a statement also expressed Arab League readiness to help Sudanese parties reach a sustainable resolution to the crisis. The meeting was held upon an invitation from Egypt and Saudi Arabia and chaired by Egypt's permanent representatives, Ambassador Mohammed Mustafa Arafat. The Council also called for all Arab ambassadors in Khartoum to exert efforts to help restore stability in the country through holding contacts with all concerned Sudanese bodies. Joining us over the phone is Dr. Sharif Amiri, political analyst. Good evening to you, sir.
Good evening.
President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi held a meeting with the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, where he asked for calm in Sudan. What is requested from the international community at this time to restore calm?
Well, it's not requested from the international community. It's requested rather by the factions inside Sudan. We have seen the call for a truce, as Egypt called yesterday for the truce, and the same thing has been done by all the international community today, and nothing was expected. We are heading towards a very dangerous path. I'm not optimistic at all. I see that both parties, whether the rapid intervention force of Colonel Doglo and the army headed by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, I think that both of them now are gearing for the next round of killings, and it won't stop like that.
Yes.
We all know that there are some difficult points concerning the support that those forces are getting from outside Sudan. It's very complicated because there are Arab countries divided. Some are supporting the rapid intervention force and others the army.
Yes, but
so
sir,
this is very complicated.
Yes, I understand that it is very complicated, but the one thing that is for sure is that the Arab League had convened for an emergency meeting on Sunday to discuss the situation in Sudan, and everyone at the meeting had spoke about the need and necessity for restoring calm. Do you believe the Arab League could help in this process?
No, I won't lie to you. No, because what we are seeing now that both parties are getting arms and getting ready, and they're not listening to anyone. They're not willing to listen to anyone. They don't want to listen to anyone. And what is dangerous is that all what we're seeing today was prepared for several weeks ago. So money was spent, arms were delivered, deployment was made. So all that won't disappear by just a call for calm.
Okay, Dr. Sharif Amir, a political analyst, thank you so much for joining us over the phone. We're going to take a short break and move on. Arab Parliament demanded immediate and urgent intervention to stop violations carried out by the occupation forces against Palestinian detainees in prisons and provide safety for them. The Arab Parliament also renewed its calls on the UN to form an international fact-finding committee to visit the occupation prisons and detect the breaches against the detainees arrested by the occupation. It also stressed its total solidarity with the Palestinian detainees, also calling on the international community to take serious international action to press on the occupation authorities and oblige them to immediately release the detainees and stop violation against them. Russian President Vladimir Putin has met his commanders on 2 regions of Ukraine that Moscow claims to have annexed, while Russian forces stepped up heavy artillery bombardment and airstrikes on the devastated eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut. The Kremlin said on Tuesday that the Russian President Vladimir Putin has visited the military headquarters in Ukraine's Kherson and Luhansk regions, which are partly held by Russia. Putin attended a military command meeting in the Kherson region to hear reports from commanders of the airborne forces and the DNPR army group and other senior officers on the situation in Kherson and Zaporozhye region, both of which have proclaimed part of Russia. Russian troops retreated from Kherson, the regional capital, last November and have been reinforcing their position on the opposite bank of the Dnipro River in anticipation of a Ukrainian counter-offensive. Putin has also visited National Guard headquarters in Ukraine's eastern Luhansk region, another part of Ukraine which Moscow annexed. Ukrainian forces have said they are preparing for a spring counter-offensive. After Putin's visit was made public on Tuesday, Ukrainian officials said Russian forces had shelled the central market area of Kherson, injuring 6. Much of the fighting is now concentrated around the eastern town of Bakhmut, which has become the longest and bloodiest battle of the conflict. His trips to Kherson and Luhansk came after the Kremlin said in March that the Russian leader had made a surprise trip to the port of Mariupol that Moscow captured after a long siege last spring. Russia's defense ministry said on Tuesday 2 Russian strategic bombers, those capable of carrying nuclear warheads, carried out routine patrol flights over the Sea of Okhotsk and Bering Sea off Russia's far east. Japanese defense ministry later said in a statement that it had scrambled a jet fighter in response to Russian information gathering aircraft over the Sea of Japan. Japan's chief cabinet secretary Harikozo Matsuno said on Monday that Tokyo had lodged a protest with Russia over its military exercises around disputed islands near Japan's Hokkaido. The group of 7 industrial powers drew together on Tuesday to criticize China's coercion of Taiwan and Russia's threat to station nuclear weapons in Belarus, promising to intensify sanctions on Moscow for its war in neighboring Ukraine. G7 foreign ministers on Tuesday urged warring forces to end hostilities as well in Sudan and negotiate, days after the fighting that killed almost 200 people. A weeks-long power struggle in the country exploded into deadly violence Saturday between the forces of the 2 generals, Chief Abdel Fattah Burhan and Deputy Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, the commander of the paramilitary support forces. They warned the fighting threatens the security and safety of Sudanese civilians and undermines efforts to restore Sudan's democratic transition. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said he had spoken with the generals and underscored the urgent need for ceasefire. Following the call, Daglo said in a tweet that the pair had discussed pressing issues on Sudan, adding he was grateful for the U.S. commitment to restoring stability. Blinken also confirmed a U.S. diplomatic convoy had been fired upon Monday, though those inside were unharmed in what he called a reckless act. In a separate incident, the EU ambassador to Sudan was attacked in his way home to Khartoum on Monday. Battles have taken place throughout the vast country. There are fears of regional spillover to the conflict. Medics in Sudan have earlier given a death toll of nearly 100 civilians and doubling it today. And the official doctors' union warned fighting had heavily damaged multiple hospitals in Khartoum and other cities, with some completely out of service. The WHO warned that several Khartoum hospitals have run out of blood transfusion equipment, intravenous fluids, and other vital supplies. In the western region of Darfur, International Medical Organization MSF reported receiving 136 wounded in the hospitals there. 3 UN WFP program staff have also been among those who've died on Saturday. A number of organizations have temporarily suspended operations in the country, where 1/3 of the population needs aid. In the world of business and finance, the Group of 7 wealthy nations vowed to work to hasten the shift towards renewable energy, according to a coalition statement on Monday, that it will also keep a $60 per barrel price cap on Russian oil amid rising global crude prices and calls by some countries for a lower price cap to restrict Moscow's revenues. Germany sees a chance that a deal to accelerate phasing out fossil fuels, similar to the one reached over the weekend by the Group of 7 rich nations, could be done at this year's UN Climate Summit in Dubai, according to senior government officials. In the joint statement at their meeting in Sapporo, Japan, G7 energy and climate ministers agreed to accelerate the phase-out of unabated fossil fuels so as to achieve net zero in energy systems by 2050. The German official, who spoke on condition of anonymity, said he believed there is a chance to reach a similar deal at the UN Climate Summit to be hosted in the UAE, a major oil producer and a member of the OPEC countries. The G7 also set big new collective targets for solar power and offshore wind capacity, agreeing to speed up renewable energy developments, part of a wider push to address the energy crisis provoked by Russia's incursion into Ukraine. Sultan Al-Jaber of the UAE Minister for Advanced Industry and Technology participated in the summit, telling a closed session that renewable capacity needs to be tripled by 2030 and increased sixfold by 2040. A German official also said on Tuesday that the deal the G7 reached over the weekend on the gas sector allows upstream investments but does not welcome such investments. Japan wants to keep liquefied natural gas as a transition fuel. The G7 said investments in the gas sector can be appropriate to address potential market shortfalls provoked by the energy crisis if implemented in a manner consistent with climate objectives. Joining us over the phone to tell us more about this is Salah Hafiz, the head of the National Environment Authority. Good evening to you, sir.
Good evening to you.
Germany at the G7 meetings sees a chance that the deal to accelerate phasing out fossil fuels could be done by the COP28 summit. What does an accelerated timeline actually mean for phasing out fossil fuel?
Well, I'm the former chief executive of the environment, not the present one.
I apologize for that.
Well, this is something that has been repeatedly said by all the stakeholders, that they accelerate the energy, the renewable energy processes to reach net zero by 2050. So I've been hearing this now for year after year, and in the last summit. So this is something that has been said before, but I would like to see deeds in order and commitments.
Yes.
So far, the COPE meetings did not come with commitments, signed commitments like Kyoto commitment, for instance, in 1997.
Yes.
This was a commitment and almost a law that all members have to adhere to. This is the problem, given, of course, that the geopolitics play very important role because of the war between Russia and Ukraine. And now Japan, they say, we will keep the LNG as transitional. So this means that this is very important for Japan because they depend solely now on LNG, and they have liquefaction and gasification. So they're all talking about their problems and trying to introduce something, whereas the Emirates, the minister said that he would like to see cut down to 1/3 by the year 2030 and by increase to 1/6 or 6 times by the year 2040.
Yes.
So they're all very promising statements, but the clincher for this is to see deeds and commitments, signed commitments for COP28 to be successful.
Yes, so basically actionable objectives, that's what you're trying to say.
This is correct.
Also during the G7 meetings, it coincides that they also spoke about a price cap on oil of $60. Do you believe that this is related to the talks of having a shift towards clean energy, and will this cap actually hold in the oil market?
Theoretically, if you keep the price of oil is high now,
yes,
because the OPEC Plus decided to reduce production, and hence price has gone up. So pricing going up will help renewable energy to make the right introduction to the market, because the cost is a very important factor in deciding which way to go. So, but to put a cap mainly to reduce the resources of Russia and hence make it weaker in the war. So, but the price of oil, it's a matter of demand, supply and demand.
Yes.
So this has been also repeatedly said by Germany and the European Union. But I don't think it's practical to do it, because now they're asking the oil to be paid in the currency other than dollar, and so maneuvers, geopolitics, but hopefully they can introduce the system that can accommodate all their desires and also reduce the emission.
OPEC countries, specifically the GCC countries, are taking major strides when it comes to green energy and environmentally friendly industries. Does this mean that they have plans, once the use of oil becomes obsolete, for their future and for their economies?
Well, Germany, of course, is the most industrious country in Europe, and they phased out of the nuclear. The nuclear is not bad for the environment, by the way, but because of the Green Party, they're putting a lot of pressure for Germany to phase out of the. So this will put a burden to also reach net zero. Net zero meaning that not to stop emission altogether, because emission of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a natural gas in the atmosphere because of the photosynthesis and the life at large. But zero net is to introduce the system, the things that will accommodate all the emissions that are introduced because of the artificial industry and so on, in order to keep the carbon dioxide
Yes.
stabilizing in the atmosphere. So now the burden is double-fold because of the phasing out of the nuclear energy, and also the war with the supply from Russia for natural gas. They're thinking, of course, they're looking into producing green hydrogen,
Yes.
but I don't think they will do it before 4 more years or so.
Yes.
So they're fighting with time, they're racing with time, but definitely they're taking very important steps toward achieving the net zero by the year 2050.
So, sir, do you actually believe that the world could achieve its goal of reaching net zero by 2050? Is this something that is achievable, or are we going to somehow push the deadline?
So far, it's not achievable because we're already approaching 1.2 degrees above the level of the industrial period in the 18th and 19th century. So we're by going along the same programs, we will go above 1.5, definitely 1.5 degree.
Yeah.
So major steps, substantial movements have to be introduced. And it is a big problem when wars and sanctions are imposed and the price of oil is going up and down. So it all makes the factors that delay, but I'm really hopeful that the coming COP in November of this year, they make commitment like the commitments we took for the funds, the fund that our Prime Minister, Foreign Minister introduced, and he's following up, in order to achieve some progress with this. But just giving pledges and promises and things like that
Yes.
will be very difficult to reach 1.5 degree only by the year 2050. And but I should hope that things more stringent to be introduced to achieve this important target that threatens planet Earth.
Hopefully this will happen, Mr. Salah Hafiz, the former Vice President of the National Petroleum Authority. Thank you so much for joining us over the phone. We're going to take a short break and move on to the rest of the episode. And moving on, just a month after the biggest banking crisis in more than a decade, the world's top economic and financial policymakers gathered in Washington and said surprisingly little about financial system stability, at least publicly. With financial markets calmed by strong policy action to stem the outflows of bank deposits, the IMF and the World Bank spring meetings were instead dominated by calls to keep up the fight against inflation, accelerate debt restructuring for poor countries, and avoid geopolitical fragmentation of the global economy. Some officials conveyed a sense that the banking system's safety was farther down the priority list of global economic problems. World Bank President David Malpass and the IMF's Middle East Director Jihad Azur both suggested their concerns about banking system strains were mostly in the context of potentially reducing the availability of credit for emerging markets at a time when rising interest rates already were causing capital outflows. In money markets, the dollar slipped on Tuesday after better than expected growth data from China, while upbeat pay data from Britain supported the pound. The euro was at least 0.4% up to the dollar and after a two-day consecutive fall of 0.5%. The dollar index, which measures the currencies against a basket of other currencies, fell 0.3% and after having risen over 1% in the last two trading sessions. China's offshore yuan was little change at 6.8774 to the dollar. The pound was last up at 0.4% against the dollar. The Australian dollar also gained 0.4% after the RBA minutes showed that the central bank considered an 11th consecutive rate hike in April before deciding the pause. The dollar fell 0.2% to the Japanese yen, while the Kiwi rose 0.4%. Eurozone bond yields rose to their highest levels in more than a month on Tuesday as investors braced for interest rate hikes from the European Central Bank. Germany's 10-year bond yield, the benchmark for the Eurozone, rose to 2.5%, its highest since March 15th. It was last up 1.5 basis points at 2.495%. Italy's 10-year yield climbed 4.346%, the highest since March 10th. It last stood at 2 basis points higher at 4.34%. Investors were also gauging the likely impacts of stronger than expected Chinese economic growth, which came at a 4.5% year-on-year in the first quarter, according to figures released Tuesday. Germany's 2-year yield, which is sensitive to interest rate expectations, was last up at 2 basis points. That was just below Monday's one-month high of 2.905%. They expect rates to rise around 3.8% by November, the highest terminal peak price since March 10th. As banks wobbled in mid to late March, traders expected the rates to peak at around 3%. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said banks are likely to become more cautious and may tighten lending further in the wake of recent bank failures, possibly negating the further Federal Reserve interest rate hikes. Yellen said in an interview that policy actions to stem the systemic threat caused by last month's failure of the Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank had caused deposit outflows to stabilize. She said banks were likely to become somewhat more cautious in this environment, adding they already saw some tightening of lending standards in the banking system prior to. She continued to say this would lead to restriction in the credit in the economy that could be a substitute for further interest rate hikes that the Fed needs to make. Yellen is far from the only finance official expecting some retrenchment in banking credits as a result of the financial sector upheaval in the last month. Some Fed officials have said the U.S. Central Bank should adopt a more cautious footing as they expect banks to restrict lending in the months ahead. Weekly bank balance sheet data published by the Fed has yet to show a material deterioration in bank lending, while also showing that deposit outflows have stabilized in the last 2 weeks after an initial flood of withdrawals around the time of SVB and Signature failure in mid-March. China's economic growth accelerated in the latest quarter as consumers flocked back to shops and restaurants following the abrupt end of an antivirus controls. The 4.5% growth in gross domestic product from January to March, compared to the same period in 2022, was the fastest in the past year and outpaced the 2.9% growth in the previous quarter, according to government data. But authorities cautioned that China will likely face import and export pressures in the coming months amid an uncertain international economic environment, and also warned of inadequate domestic market demand in the world's #2 economy. The higher than expected rise in GDP for the quarter comes amid a rebound in consumption as people flock to shopping malls and restaurants after zero-COVID restrictions were removed at the end of 2022. Analysts initially pegged economic growth to be about 4%. Earlier this year, China's government set that year's economic growth target at around 5%, a conservative target that will only be met if GDP grows faster in the months ahead. In March, total retail sales of consumer goods went up by 10.6% year-on-year. But while consumption and retail sales have grown, other economic indicators with weaker growth, such as industrial output and fixed asset investments, indicate an uneven recovery. Industrial production output, which measures activity in the manufacturing, mining, and utilities sector, grew by 3.9% in March, compared to the same time last year. China's exports surged in March, according to data earlier the week, although this could be the result of suppliers catching up to fulfilling orders disrupted by COVID-19. In the first quarter, exports grew 8.4%, hampered by antivirus controls that caused snap lockdowns and kept people at home. GDP is expected to accelerate year-on-year, given Shanghai's COVID-19 lockdowns last year. UK unemployment edged higher in the 3 months to the end of February, according to official data, as the economy continues to be impacted by high inflation. The rate increased 3.8% from 3.7% in the 3 months to the end of January. The Office for the National Statistics said in a statement. The ONS said that the increase was driven by people unemployed for up to 6 months. Darren Morgan, the director of the Economic Statistics, said the number of days lost to strikes picked up again in February. Public and private sector workers have been striking since last year to try and win increases to pay, whose value has been eroded by elevated inflation. In the world of arts and culture, we're going to take a look at a story where King Charles will be crowned at London's Westminster Abbey on May 6th in a ceremony resplendent with pomp and pageantry with traditions dating back 1,000 years. Here's the story.
More than 6,000 British military personnel will take part in the coronation of King Charles III, the United Kingdom Forces' biggest ceremonial deployment in 7 decades. The Ministry of Defence said thousands of soldiers, sailors and aviators will escort the King and Camilla, the Queen Consort, between Buckingham Palace and Westminster Abbey on their way to and from the 6th of May ceremony. Gun salutes will ring out from British warships and army bases across the country, and later military aircraft from the Second World War Spitfire to modern fighter jets will perform a fly-past over the palace. The Defence Secretary Ben Wallace said it would be a spectacular and fitting tribute to the monarch, who is also Commander-in-Chief of the UK Armed Forces. Admiral Tony Radakin, Chief of the Defence Staff, said the military side of the coronation reflects centuries of tradition, but it is in the active of the integral role the armed forces play in modern Britain and the extraordinary ways we support the nation, whether deterring aggression and maintaining stability worldwide or strengthening our domestic resilience and prosperity, as he said. Hundreds of troops from 35 Commonwealth countries will also play roles in the ceremony for Britain's first coronation since that of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953.
Moving to sports, Liverpool crushed Leeds 6-1 as Cody Gakpo's controversial opener provided the spark for the Reds' first win in the Premier League games on Monday. Jurgen Klopp's side took the lead at Elland Road when Gakpo's goal was allowed to stand despite the ball striking Trent Alexander-Arnold's arm in the build-up. It was reported the VAR official did not check the incident because it happened too far back in the move. But Leeds were furious at the perceived injustice. Holders Real Madrid breezed past Chelsea into the semi-finals of the Champions League with Rodrigo's double securing a 2-0 win at Stamford Bridge tonight for a 4-0 aggregate victory that set up a likely mouth-watering clash with Manchester City. Trailing 2-0 from last week's clash in the Bernabeu, Chelsea had their moment but failed to take their chances in the opening half and at the start of the second and were made to pay as Rodrigo sent the silky Spaniards through. While Chelsea's season will end trophyless under their new American owners despite a £500 million outlay on new players. 14 times European champions Real Madrid march on, with manager Carlo Ancelotti eyeing the trophy for a 5th time. Andrei Rublev made the most of Holger Rune's nerves to win a seesaw Monte Carlo final 5-7, 6-2, 7-5 on Sunday, as the Russian's talent was finally rewarded with a Masters title. The 5th seed stayed composed when it mattered to eventually run down his 19-year-old opponent and claim the most prestigious title of his career. Rublev, who's 25, was 4-1 down in the decider, but grounded his way back into the contest to prevail on his second match point with an ace at a sun-drenched Monte Carlo country club. It was Rublev's third attempt in the Masters final after failing at the final hurdle here in Monte Carlo and in Cincinnati in 2021. Rune, who burst into the limelight at last year's French Open when he reached the quarterfinals, needed nearly 3 hours to beat the Italian Yannick Sinner in the semi-finals. Alex Rins won Sunday's attritional Grand Prix of the Americas following a blunder from the Ducati MotoGP world champion Francesco Bagnaia. Rins capitalized on a fall from leader and pole sitter Bagnaia to claim the third leg of the season and end Honda's long winless run. Luca Marini took second with Fabio Quartararo in third. Bagnaia won Saturday's sprint but left the showpiece race in Austin pointless as Marco Bezzecchi, who finished sixth, extended his lead at the top of the riders' standings. Rins, a winner for the Suzuki at the Circuit 2019, was gifted the lead before the halfway stage of 20-lap race when Bagnaia's bike hit the Texan tarmac. Second to Bagnaia in the sprint 24 hours earlier, Rins controlled the race perfectly from that moment on for his sixth win in motorcycling Premier Class and his first for his new team. Well, this brings us to the end of the sports news and this edition of Nile TV Newsroom Live. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more here on Nile TV.